Now, the Paris Agreement, as any multilateral treaty, contains detailed rules as to how it will come into operation, how, what we say is, how it will enter into force. And therefore, the adoption of the agreement triggered a legal process towards the entry into force. The first step in that process was the signature of the agreement. By signing the agreement, states agreed or gave their commitment, their political commitment, to launch the domestic processes that will lead to their acceptance of the Paris Agreement. We did have a historic ceremony on April 22nd. On that date, the Secretary General invited the highest dignitaries of the entire world to gather in New York at a formal ceremony for the signature of the Paris Agreement. And it was a truly historic moment. We reached as many as 175 signatures in one single day, which makes of this the largest signature ceremony for a treaty in history, quite simply. But this is just the first step. The Paris Agreement also provides that for it to enter into force, you need for states to ratify or accept it. And more specifically, we need for at least 55 states, representing 55% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, to ratify or accept the agreement. This is a very wise provision, since it ensures that a critical mass be gathered before the agreement enter into force for it to constitute an effective response to climate change. And I'm happy to say that we have already made quite a few steps in the road towards the entry into force of the agreement. Already on April 22nd, as many as 15 states took the initiative not just of signing the Paris Agreement, but also of ratifying it. And a number of states have joined them in the months that followed. Earlier this month, the presidents of China and the United States at a ceremony organized in Hangzhou, China, in the margins of the G20 summit, deposited their instruments of ratification and acceptance to the Paris Agreement. And this, of course, represents an important step in the road towards the entry into force of the agreement. As of today, the Paris Agreement has been ratified or accepted by as many as 27 states, which represent around 40% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. We need a further 28 states to ratify the agreement, representing around 15% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, to reach the landmark that is required for the entry into force of the agreement. Joining the Paris Agreement is a two-step process. The first step is accomplished at the domestic level. Each state needs to follow the legal process that is provided for under their constitution, under their legislation, to accept the Paris Agreement. This may greatly vary depending on the country. Some countries require for the parliament to adopt an act, usually called an act of ratification, by which they accept the agreement. Some countries required some sort of judicial review by the highest court, and of course the intervention of the executive power. Other countries only require the executive power to intervene and accept the agreement. Once the domestic procedures have been attained, we have a second step. And this second step is for the state to formally commit to the final agreement at the international level. And this is done through the deposit of an instrument of ratification, of acceptance, with the Secretary General, who is the custodian of the Paris Agreement. People often ask, why is it that countries that have appeared on the news as having ratified the Paris Agreement at the national level do not appear on the official website of the United Nations, the treaties.un.org website, as already having accepted the agreement. And this is indeed because of this two-step process. They may have completed their domestic process of ratification, but may not have yet committed themselves at the international level with the deposit of a formal instrument of ratification or acceptance. The Secretary General invited the high-level dignitaries that will come to the General Assembly for the opening of this year's session to seize the opportunity of their presence in New York, to take action on the Paris Agreement. And he is therefore organizing a high-level event, which is to take place on September 21st at the General Assembly Hall from 8 to 9 a.m., in which these dignitaries will have the opportunity to hand to the Secretary General himself their instruments of ratification or acceptance or approval to the Paris Agreement. 30 days after we'll reach that landmark of 55 states ratifying the agreement, representing 55% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, the Paris Agreement will enter into force. And this is not the end of it. One could say it's actually the beginning of the story. At that moment, the Paris Agreement will start to be implemented. The states are going to start taking those measures that they have determined at the national level to combat climate change, if they haven't already started to do so, and they will cooperate under the processes that the Paris Agreement has established for this purpose. The Paris Agreement talks about capacity building, technological development and transfer, public awareness, adaptation, and of course finance and cooperation, transparency and stock-taking at the global level to combat climate change. This will be the next phase in the life of the Paris Agreement, a phase, by the way, in which other states will hopefully continue to join the Paris Agreement, since 55 states is not our ultimate goal. What we expect is for the Paris Agreement to reach a universal scope, and the same universal scope that other environmental treaties have reached, such as the Framework Convention on Climate Change or the Vienna Convention on the Ozone Layer and its Montreal Protocol, which are prime examples of how the international community may join its forces in order to combat a threat to humankind.